It started with a signature, just ink pressed into paper, the kind of quiet decision people make every day without a second thought. A life insurance policy modest at first glance, worth just enough to feel responsible, to feel safe, to feel like someone was planning ahead for the people they loved. Months later, that same document would sit in an evidence folder, its edges worn from being handled too many times by investigators who couldn't ignore what it had become. Because by then, the number attached to that policy would no longer matter. What mattered was the trail it left behind. What mattered was that multiple people were dead. What mattered was that at the center of it all was a man no one had ever questioned, a man neighbors described as dependable, calm, the kind of person you trust with your home, your family, your life. His name was Daniel Reeves, and if you had met him back then, you would have seen nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing that would make you think twice. That's what made it so difficult to understand later, when the pattern finally became impossible to ignore, when the small decisions started to line up in a way that no longer looked like coincidence. What looked like financial planning at first glance would slowly reveal something far more calculated, something built piece by piece over time, hidden behind routine, hidden behind trust. Because this wasn't just about money and it wasn't just about paperwork. This was about control, about patience, about a plan that relied on one thing above all else, that no one would ever suspect him. And for a while no one did. Not the neighbors, not the friends, not even the people closest to him. That's what allowed it to continue, what allowed it to grow, what allowed more names to be added to a list that no one even knew existed yet. Each policy, each conversation, each quiet moment was part of something larger, something that would only make sense when it was already too late to stop it. Because by the time investigators began to ask the right questions, by the time they started connecting the dates, the payments, the sudden losses that seemed unrelated on the surface, the truth had already taken shape. It was no longer a possibility, it was a reality. And the most disturbing part was not how it ended, but how easily it all began, with something so ordinary that no one thought to look twice. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened next would force an entire community to reconsider what they thought they knew about trust, about responsibility, and about the quiet decisions that can carry consequences no one is prepared to face. Because this wasn't just fraud, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a blueprint for something far worse, something that would unfold slowly, deliberately, and with a precision that left very little room for chance. And by the time investigators realized what was happening, by the time the pieces finally came together in a way that could no longer be dismissed or explained away, it was already too late. 3 victims, 1 connection, and a payout that kept growing. At first, those words didn't exist together in any official report, not in any statement given to the public, not in anything that would have raised immediate alarm. They were pieces scattered across separate incidents, filed away under different dates, different circumstances, different explanations that made sense at the time. But when those pieces were finally placed side by side, when someone took a step back and looked at the bigger picture, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Each victim had crossed paths with Daniel Reeves in a meaningful way, not casually, not distantly, but closely enough to trust him, closely enough to let him into their lives in ways that most people reserve for family or lifelong friends. And each time, without exception, there was a financial document quietly sitting in the background, signed well before anything went wrong, naming Daniel Reeves as the beneficiary. The payouts weren't identical, but they followed a pattern, increasing just enough each time to raise a question that no one had asked early on. Was this all coincidence, or was it something far more deliberate? Investigators would later circle the same 3 questions again and again, writing them down, revisiting them, unable to move forward without confronting them directly. Was this planned from the very beginning, or had something shifted along the way that turned ordinary decisions into something far more calculated? Why were all the victims connected to the same person, and how had that connection gone unnoticed for so long without raising concern? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how did no one see it coming? Not the people closest to him, not the institutions involved, not even those trained to detect patterns exactly like this. Because Daniel Reeves did not stand out, he did not behave in ways that would immediately trigger suspicion, and that normalcy became one of the most important parts of the story. It allowed time to pass, it allowed events to unfold without interruption, and it allowed each new development to be explained away before anyone thought to look deeper. To understand how this turned into mass murder, you have to go back to the beginning, to a time before the questions existed, before the connections were drawn, before the name Daniel Reeves meant anything beyond a familiar face in a quiet neighborhood. You have to go back to before the first policy was ever signed, before money entered the equation, before anyone had a reason to doubt what they were being told. Because the truth is, none of this started with violence, and none of it started with suspicion. It started with something far more ordinary, something that would have looked responsible, even thoughtful, to anyone watching from the outside. And that is exactly what made it so easy to miss, because when everything appears normal, when every decision can be explained, when every action fits within the boundaries of what people expect, the idea that something else could be taking shape rarely crosses anyone's mind until it is already too late to stop it. By all accounts, Daniel Reeves was ordinary, the kind of man people felt comfortable around without ever needing a reason why. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where routines rarely changed, where people waved from their driveways and trusted that the person next door was exactly who they appeared to be. Daniel fit into that world effortlessly. He kept his lawn trimmed, his house in order, and his interactions polite but measured. Neighbors described him as reliable, someone who showed up when he said he would, someone who listened more than he spoke. There was nothing in his demeanor that suggested urgency or instability, nothing that hinted at the kind of decisions that would later define his name. If anything, he seemed cautious, the type of person who thought things through before acting, which made what followed even harder to understand for those who knew him. The first person drawn into Daniel's inner circle in a way that truly mattered was Laura Mitchell, someone who had known him long enough to trust him without hesitation. Laura was practical, grounded, the kind of person who valued stability and believed in planning for the future. She worked steadily, kept close ties with her family, and wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks. Their relationship, whether seen as close friendship or something more, appeared balanced on the surface. They spent time together in ways that felt normal, shared conversations that seemed unremarkable, and built a level of familiarity that made Daniel's presence in her life feel permanent. To anyone observing from the outside, there was nothing about their connection that would raise concern. It looked like trust, plain and simple, the kind of trust that grows slowly and becomes unquestioned over time. But behind closed doors, things were not as stable as they seemed, and the cracks, while subtle, were there long before anyone thought to look for them. Daniel's financial situation was not as secure as he allowed others to believe. There were debts that had been building quietly, obligations that demanded attention, and a growing pressure that he kept carefully hidden. He did not speak about it openly, and he did not show it in ways that would alarm those around him. Instead, he maintained the same calm exterior, the same measured tone, the same sense of control that made people believe everything was under control. But control in Daniel's case meant more than just keeping up appearances. It meant managing every detail, every interaction, every decision in a way that served a purpose only he fully understood. There were moments, small and easily overlooked, where that need for control became more visible. Decisions that seemed unusually calculated, conversations that lingered just a bit longer on topics others would consider routine, questions that carried a level of interest that didn't quite match the situation. Laura noticed some of it, but not in a way that caused alarm. To her, it felt like attentiveness, like someone who cared enough to think ahead, someone who wanted to make responsible choices. And when the subject of long-term planning came up, when discussions shifted toward security and what would happen in the future, it didn't feel out of place. It felt like the natural progression of a relationship built on trust. What no one knew at the time, not Laura, not the people around them, not even those who would later try to reconstruct every detail, was that these conversations were not as ordinary as they seemed. They were steps carefully considered and deliberately taken, each one moving things forward in a direction that only Daniel Reeves could see clearly. The debts, the pressure, the need for control, they were not separate issues existing on their own. They were part of something larger, something that required patience and precision. And Laura Mitchell, without realizing it, had already become a central part of that process, positioned in a way that would only make sense when everything else began to unfold. No one knew, not at that moment, not in those quiet, ordinary days, that she was already being placed within a plan that had begun long before anyone thought to question it. It began quietly with a single life insurance policy, the kind of decision that rarely draws attention and is almost always framed as responsible planning. The conversation between Daniel Reeves and Laura Mitchell did not feel unusual at the time, at least not to her. It was presented as preparation, as a way to ensure that no matter what happened, there would be some level of financial stability left behind. Daniel spoke about it calmly, carefully, choosing his words in a way that made the idea feel practical rather than urgent. The policy itself was not excessive, not large enough to raise immediate suspicion, but significant enough to matter, a figure that sat comfortably within the range of what someone might reasonably choose. And when the paperwork was completed, when the signatures were placed and the details finalized, Daniel Reeves was listed as the primary beneficiary, a decision that seemed logical given the trust between them and the role he had positioned himself to play in her life. At the time, nothing about it stood out as concerning. There were no alarms, no second thoughts, no outside voices questioning the decision. It blended into the routine of everyday life, just another document filed away, just another step taken toward what appeared to be a secure future. Even those who later examined the timeline would admit that, on its own, the policy did not look like a warning sign. It looked like something people do every day, something encouraged, something expected. And that normalcy became one of the most important elements in what followed, because it allowed everything to move forward without interruption. It allowed Daniel to remain exactly what everyone believed him to be, a man making practical choices, a man thinking ahead, a man acting in a way that aligned perfectly with the image he had built over time. But in hindsight, when the full picture began to take shape, that single decision would be seen differently. It would no longer be viewed as routine or responsible, but as the first move in a sequence that had been carefully constructed. The amount insured, the timing, the designation of beneficiary, each detail would be revisited and re-examined, not as isolated choices but as part of something larger. Investigators would later point to this moment as the point where everything truly began, not because it was dramatic or obvious, but because it was so easily accepted without question. And that is what made it effective, what allowed it to pass unnoticed, what allowed it to set the stage for everything that came after. Because not long after that policy was signed, not long after the ink had dried and the document had been filed away, something happened that would shift the story in a way no one was prepared for. It was sudden, unexpected, and at first it carried none of the weight it would later hold. It was treated as an isolated event, a moment of misfortune that no one could have predicted. But that moment, that single incident, would become impossible to separate from the decision that came before it. And when people finally began to connect those 2 points, when they started to see them not as coincidence but as cause and effect, the story of Daniel Reeves would begin to change in a way that could no longer be ignored. It was sudden, unexpected, and ruled an accident. The call came late in the evening, the kind of call that arrives without warning and changes everything in a matter of seconds. Laura Mitchell had been found unresponsive inside her home, a place that had always felt safe, familiar, controlled. By the time emergency responders arrived, there was little they could do. The initial explanation was simple, almost too simple: a household incident, a possible reaction to something, a sequence of events that no one could fully reconstruct, but that seemed on the surface to fall within the realm of tragic misfortune. There were no immediate signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing that would suggest the involvement of another person. And so, as quickly as the questions began, they were quieted by the conclusion that this was an accident, an unfortunate, isolated event that no one could have predicted. The community responded the way communities often do in moments like this, with sympathy, with support, with an effort to make sense of something that didn't feel fair. Neighbors brought food, offered condolences, spoke about Laura Mitchell in the past tense with a kind of disbelief that hadn't yet settled into acceptance. She was remembered as dependable, kind, someone who kept her life in order and didn't invite unnecessary risk. Her death felt out of place, a disruption that didn't align with the person people believed they knew. And at the center of that response was Daniel Reeves, the man who now stood not just as someone connected to her, but as someone who appeared to be grieving alongside everyone else. He answered questions when asked, accepted sympathy without drawing attention to himself, and remained consistent with the image he had always presented. There was nothing in his behavior that gave anyone reason to look at him differently, nothing that suggested he was anything other than another person affected by loss. But there was one detail, small enough to be overlooked at the time, that investigators would later revisit with a different perspective. It wasn't something dramatic, not something that immediately contradicted the conclusion that had already been reached. It was a piece of information buried within reports, a timing issue, a subtle inconsistency, something that didn't carry enough weight on its own to change the outcome. And so it remained where it was, recorded but not pursued, acknowledged but not questioned in a way that would have altered the direction of the case. That is often how these things begin, not with a clear mistake, but with a detail that seems insignificant until it is placed next to something else that gives it meaning. Because this wouldn't be the last time this story repeated itself. At the time, no one had a reason to believe that what had happened to Laura Mitchell was part of anything larger, no reason to think that the explanation they had accepted would one day be challenged. It was filed away, both officially and emotionally, as a tragic accident, something to be remembered but not investigated further. But patterns do not announce themselves immediately, and repetition does not become visible until there is more than one event to compare. When that second event came, when another life was lost under circumstances that felt just familiar enough to be unsettling, the story that had once seemed complete would begin to reopen in a way no one was prepared for. Another policy, another death, another payout. At first, no one said those words out loud, not in that order, not in a way that suggested they belonged together. The second loss came months after Laura Mitchell's death, far enough apart to feel unrelated, far enough apart to avoid immediate comparison. This time it was someone else within Daniel Reeves' circle, someone who trusted him in a different way but with the same level of confidence. someone who had also made what seemed like a responsible decision not long before everything went wrong. The circumstances were, once again, explained as accidental, another moment of bad luck, another situation that didn't quite make sense but didn't raise enough concern to challenge the conclusion. And once again, when the paperwork was reviewed, when the details were quietly processed and finalized, Daniel Reeves' name appeared in the same place it had before, listed clearly as the beneficiary, positioned to receive the payout without question. The similarities were there, but they were easy to dismiss when viewed individually. Each case had its own explanation, its own context, its own set of circumstances that allowed it to stand on its own without inviting deeper scrutiny. People do take out life insurance policies. Accidents do happen. Loss, as difficult as it is, does not always come with warning signs or clear reasons. That is what allowed the pattern to remain hidden, what allowed each event to pass through the system without triggering the kind of attention that might have brought everything to a halt. And as time moved forward, as the second payout was processed and absorbed into Daniel Reeves' financial situation, the foundation for what came next was already being set in place. By the time the third death occurred, the spacing between events had narrowed just enough to feel different, just enough to create a sense that something was beginning to repeat itself in a way that could no longer be ignored. The circumstances once again carried that same ambiguity, the same lack of clear cause that had defined the previous cases, and once again the explanation settled on the idea of an unfortunate accident. But when investigators, prompted by routine review rather than immediate suspicion, began to align the timelines, when they placed the dates side by side and traced the connections back to Daniel Reeves, the similarities became harder to dismiss. Three individuals each connected to the same man, each with a life insurance policy in place naming him as beneficiary, each death followed by a financial payout that had grown incrementally larger with each occurrence. The numbers alone began to tell a story that words had not yet fully captured. The progression was clear, not dramatic in any single instance, but unmistakable when viewed as a whole. The circumstances, while slightly varied, shared enough in common to raise a question that could no longer be set aside as coincidence. And when that question was finally written down, when it was placed in front of those responsible for examining the case in greater detail, it forced a shift in perspective that changed everything that followed. Coincidence or pattern? It was no longer a theoretical question, no longer something that could be answered casually or ignored in favor of simpler explanations. It demanded attention, it demanded comparison, and it demanded a closer look at Daniel Reeves not as a bystander affected by repeated loss, but as the one constant present in every case. By the third death, the odds of coincidence were almost impossible to justify. The alignment of events, the repetition of outcomes, the consistent presence of financial gain, all of it pointed towards something that could no longer be explained away as misfortune. And as that realization began to take hold, as investigators started to move beyond surface-level conclusions and into a deeper examination of what had actually occurred, the story that had once seemed fragmented began to come together in a way that was far more troubling than anyone had initially imagined. That's when investigators started asking a dangerous question, one that shifted everything from routine review into something far more serious, something that required them to challenge conclusions that had already been accepted. What if these weren't accidents at all? It was a question that carried weight not just because of what it implied, but because of what it forced them to reconsider. Cases that had been closed were reopened, reports that had been filed away were pulled back into focus, and details that once seemed minor were now examined with a level of scrutiny they hadn't received before. The first step was to revisit the autopsies, to look again at the medical findings that had supported the original conclusions. And while nothing immediately contradicted those findings in a way that would overturn them entirely, there were small inconsistencies, subtle indicators that suggested the causes of death may not have been as straightforward as they first appeared. Individually, those details could be explained, but together, they created uncertainty, and uncertainty was enough to justify going deeper. At the same time, another line of investigation was developing, one that focused not on how the victims died, but on what happened afterward. The financial trail connected to Daniel Reeves began to take shape in a way that was far more structured than anyone had initially realized. Each payout followed a similar process, each one tied directly to a policy that had been established before the death occurred, each one increasing in value just enough to suggest progression rather than coincidence. Bank records, transaction histories, and policy documents were laid out side by side, forming a timeline that mirrored the sequence of deaths with unsettling precision. The timing of each policy, the proximity between the signing and the death, the pattern of financial gain, all of it pointed toward a level of planning that could not be easily dismissed. It was not chaotic, it was not impulsive, it was consistent, controlled, and deliberate in a way that demanded attention. As investigators brought Daniel Reeves in for questioning, the contrast between what they were beginning to see on paper and the man sitting in front of them became one of the most challenging aspects of the case. He remained calm, cooperative, and composed, answering questions without hesitation, maintaining the same demeanor that had defined him from the beginning. There were no visible cracks, no sudden shifts in behavior, nothing that immediately aligned him with the growing concerns surrounding the case. And yet, the more they compared his statements to the timelines, to the financial records, to the details emerging from the reopened reports, the more difficult it became to reconcile his explanations with the evidence. There were gaps, small at first but noticeable, moments where the sequence of events did not fully align, where the clarity he presented did not match the complexity of what had actually occurred. And when they looked closer, when they began to connect those gaps with the inconsistencies in the medical findings and the structure of the financial trail, they realized something that would redefine the entire investigation. This was not a series of unrelated events. This was not a collection of unfortunate accidents tied together by coincidence. The alignment was too precise, the repetition too consistent, the outcomes too beneficial to one person to ignore. Every detail, from the initial conversations about planning to the final execution of each policy, began to fit into a framework that suggested intention rather than chance. And in that moment, as the full scope of what they were uncovering started to take shape, the question was no longer whether something was wrong, but how far it extended. Because what they were seeing was not just a pattern, it was a method, and that method carried a realization that was impossible to overlook. Every death had been carefully engineered. The truth was far darker than anyone imagined, not because it was hidden in some complex mystery, but because it had been carried out in a way that blended so easily into everyday life that no one thought to question it until the pattern became undeniable. What investigators uncovered was not a series of impulsive acts, but a method that relied on patience, timing, and a clear understanding of how to avoid suspicion. In Laura Mitchell's case, the cause of death that had once been accepted as accidental began to look different under closer examination. Substances that could be introduced gradually, symptoms that could be mistaken for common conditions, and timing that ensured there would be no immediate reason to suspect anything beyond a medical episode. The same approach appeared again in the second and third cases, with slight variations, adjustments that suggested learning, refinement, and control. Nothing was rushed, nothing was left to chance, and every step was taken in a way that allowed the outcome to appear natural, or at the very least, explainable without raising alarm. Premeditation became impossible to deny as the timeline expanded. The policies were not afterthoughts, they were foundations established well in advance, giving each action that followed a purpose that only became clear in hindsight. Conversations about responsibility, about planning for the future, about ensuring stability, all took on a different meaning when placed against what investigators now understood to be a sequence of deliberate decisions. Daniel Reeves had not forced his way into these situations. He had positioned himself within them, building trust slowly, allowing others to feel secure in his presence, to believe that the choices they were making were their own. That trust became the most effective tool he had because it removed doubt before it could take hold. By the time anything went wrong, there was no reason to look at him differently, no reason to connect him to the outcome in a way that would challenge the narrative that had already been accepted. As the evidence was presented, as the details were laid out in a courtroom where each piece of the story was finally given its full context, the image of Daniel Reeves began to shift in a way that those who knew him struggled to accept. The calm, measured demeanor remained, even as the weight of the accusations grew heavier, even as the structure of the case became clearer with each passing moment. It was not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic collapse under pressure, but a gradual realization that the person they thought they understood had been operating with a level of calculation they had never considered possible. The financial gains, the timing of each policy, the progression of events, all pointed in the same direction, forming a narrative that was as consistent as it was disturbing. And at the center of that narrative were the victims, people who had trusted Daniel Reeves in ways that made what happened to them even more difficult to process. Laura Mitchell and the others had not been chosen at random. They had been selected based on proximity, on trust, on the ability to influence decisions without raising concern. They believed they were making responsible choices, that they were preparing for the future in a way that would protect the people around them. What they could not have known was that those decisions were being guided toward an outcome they would never see coming. The people who trusted him most were the ones who never stood a chance, not because they were careless, but because the very thing that connected them to Daniel Reeves was the same thing that allowed him to carry out a plan that depended entirely on being trusted without question. But even after the arrest of Daniel Reeves, one question remained, lingering in the minds of investigators, friends, and the community alike. How many more people had been touched by his actions without anyone realizing it? As authorities reviewed past cases and spoke to acquaintances, they began to uncover hints, subtle, easily overlooked connections that suggested there could be additional victims, people whose deaths had never been linked to him, whose lives had quietly intersected with his in ways that now felt ominously significant. Missed warning signs surfaced in the form of conversations, minor financial discrepancies, and relationships that had seemed harmless at the time but now appeared to fit into a pattern too consistent to ignore. Even some of the evidence that had been relied upon during the trial came under scrutiny, with forensic experts questioning whether certain details could have been interpreted differently or whether some critical pieces had been unintentionally overlooked, leaving gaps that might never be fully explained. For those left behind, the aftermath was a mixture of relief and lingering doubt. Families tried to reconcile the memory of someone they knew, a neighbor, a friend, a trusted presence, with the reality of what the investigation revealed. Homes once filled with ordinary life now felt hollow, family photos and personal mementos serving as reminders of the people who had been taken too soon, and the web of deception that had been hidden in plain sight. Daniel Reeves' conviction provided closure to some extent, but it did not erase the unsettling truth that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that normalcy can mask intention, and that trust, once given, can be manipulated in ways most people never imagine. How many times can something look like an accident before we start calling it what it really is? How many details can be dismissed as coincidence until, taken together, they reveal a reality that no one wanted to see? The story of Daniel Reeves forces those questions into sharp focus, not just as a case study of crime, but as a reflection on the very assumptions we make about people, about trust, and about the quiet decisions that shape our lives. It reminds us that appearances are not always reliable, that calm exteriors can hide calculated actions, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments carry consequences far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Do you think the system failed, or was this always going to happen? Could the pattern have been noticed sooner, or was Daniel Reeves simply too careful, too calculated, too ordinary to raise suspicion until it was already too late? These are the questions that linger long after the headlines fade, the questions that force us to reconsider how much we trust the people around us, and how easily appearances can hide intention. Let me know what you think in the comments. How would you have seen it coming, and what would you have done if you were one of the people closest to him? And if you think this case was disturbing, the next one is even worse. It's a story that will challenge everything you think you know about trust, deception, and the quiet ways ordinary lives can be manipulated toward unthinkable outcomes. Subscribe for more real stories that sound like fiction, but aren't. Each case explores the hidden layers of human behavior, the patterns we often overlook, and the consequences that can emerge when someone takes advantage of trust in ways we would never expect.